Hey guys, today we're going to take a look at the ending of the Thomas Jefferson presidency and now moving into James Madison's terms as president. And if we focus on our essential question here, we're going to look at how did the War of 1812 encourage American unity and nationalism? If we think back to the Jefferson presidency, we know that the Embargo Act of 1807 was really the last staple of Jefferson's presidency because it was a way to punish England and France for the impressment of American sailors and soldiers, merchants, but it actually ended up hurting the Americans more in the long run. So let's set the stage here for James Madison, and we see that he is the hand-picked successor. He was another Democratic Republican. Him and Jefferson aligned on almost all ideals, fighting against the Federalists and Alexander Hamilton and John Adams. And he's going to win very convincingly in both 1808 and 1812, with, you can see here in the map, the 70% and then 59% of the electoral votes respectively. And he's seen as a very well qualified man. He is the architect of the Constitution. He serves in Jefferson's presidency as a Secretary of State, so he's very well beloved and he's very well thought of highly amongst both political parties in America. As president, James Madison is going to really try to push forward even more ideals from the Democratic Republicans of a limited national government and a emphasis on states' rights rather than the stronger federal government that we saw with the Federalist Party. And you can see here in the timeline, it's going to be successful for the Democratic Republicans as they will continue their dominance well into the mid 1800s. Now, thinking back to the presidencies of John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, we know that the Americans were in quite of a bind. The English and the French navies were not taking the American merchants and sailors seriously, were oftentimes imprisoning and pressing the sailors into the British navies and violating our free trade across the Atlantic Ocean. And by the 1810s, most Americans have had enough. Now, not all are going to be on board with this, but a group of senators and congressmen are going to be called war hawks, and they demand war with Britain to defend the U.S. honor. You have war hawks such as Henry Clay, who will say that the United States are not an independent nation if they continue to not resist what the British are doing. And free trade and sailors' rights became a popular battle cry for the Warhawks as a way to kind of rally the troops per se, to gain support amongst the congressmen and for common Americans as well. So remember, setting the stage, this is not something that has just started happening. Since 1793, the British and French have been at war. They've been violating free trade. They've been using American sailors and merchants as a way to kind of force them into the British and French navies. And the Americans have tried for over 15 years to peacefully try to fix this issue. Washington signed his Proclamation of Neutrality, where he declared that they would remain neutral in the wars between Britain and France. John Adams sent over American delegates and became an insult with that X, Y, and Z affair when they were bribed by the French. And Jefferson's embargo of 1807 was another attempt to basically try to harm Britain and France economically by resisting trade, but ended up hurting the American merchants and the American trading system as a whole. So I want you to put yourselves in the shoes of President Madison. You've come now and you're the fourth president. You're the fourth president to deal with this problem, and it still has not been solved. You have a large majority, or at least a solid majority of Congress who want to go to war in that war hawk group. And you're not necessarily per se for war because you do support France and you do want to evade war at all costs. So I want you to brainstorm three solutions, and we'll talk about this in class too, but brainstorm three solutions that President Madison could use to solve the problem, and then we're going to talk about that when we meet up in class next, and we're going to select one of those alternatives, and make sure you can explain your decision. Why would you choose this one? Why is this a better option over maybe a more confrontational approach or a more diplomatic approach? So by 1812, Madison eventually has had enough, and he knows that diplomacy will no longer work, and he's going to ask Congress for a declaration of war. And this surge of patriotism is going to come across America when the Congress signs the Declaration of War and we officially go to war with England. And it's going to be kind of seen as a second American Revolution. And you can see here in the painting to the left of the screen, this kind of valiant painting showing American sailors and this kind of godly atmosphere. And it says here at the bottom, we owe allegiance to no crown, meaning that we do not need our freedom to be verified by the King of England. We are our own free people, and we're going to keep it that way. So getting ready for battle in the War of 1812 was very similar to that of the American Revolution. If we had to put betting odds on it, we would definitely say that the United States were the underdogs going into the war. They have a very small navy that was poorly trained. There has not been really a standing army outside of just militiamen since the American Revolution. However, Britain has had the largest navy in the world, the most powerful navy, and they've been fighting France for well over a decade, so they are well prepared and ready for war. So the war is not going to go well for the Americans early on. And it's important to keep in mind that the war hawks are not just motivated by getting revenge for the impressment of American sailors, but they also want a few other things as well. They want to make sure that they are not getting into wars with the Native Americans and that the British are not supporting Native Americans in wars against the United States. They also want to try to add Canada, and they want to try to move northward to try to annex Canada into the United States. So they're motivated by all these reasons, but because of this and because of the disparity between the United States military and the British military, it isn't the British are going to attack and destroy most of Middle America, and including the capital, Washington, D.C., where James Madison is forced to flee. And as you can see in the pictures here, we can see the burning and the sacking of Washington, D.C. And as the famous line goes, that Dolly Madison, James Madison's wife, saved the infamous painting of George Washington as she was running out of the White House before it was burned to the ground. The British are also going to create a siege, which, if you remember our battle tactics discussions, that it is basically where the enemy surrounds a given spot and does not let anything in or out. And they're going to do this at Fort McHenry outside of Baltimore. And this is going to be where the famous American Francis Scott Key is going to write the Star Spangled Banner, basically as a poem describing what he's seeing as the battle is going on between the British and the American soldiers. So remember, the American military was not anywhere close to the skill and the prestige of the British, and this was very well seen in our attempts to actually invade Canada early on in the war. However, even though the Army was getting their butt whooped, the Navy was doing much better, even though they were heavily outnumbered, they won a number of ship-to-ship combats where the British were soon bottled up and almost the Americans were able to destroy them in the American harbors. By 1813, then, the American Army, or the Navy, I'm sorry, was able to pave the way for William Henry Harrison, who we'll talk about later as one of the future presidents, is going to be able to defeat the British at the Battle of Thames, which was near present-day Detroit. And the reason why this is significant, because it does show that the Americans are starting to turn the tides of the war, and they're also being successful in their fights against the Native Americans, led by Tecumseh, who was a Native American who was joining allies with the other Native American tribes of the Middle American part of the continent, and also the British as a way to try to fight back against the United States. So even though the war was kind of going back and forth, and we could say that the British were probably winning more than the Americans were outside of the Battle of Detroit, they did want to end the war very quickly, and they did not want to get bogged down in a war, and it was very evident that it was going to be the case. They did not want to have another American Revolution, where we talked about where George Washington just basically tried to avoid war or avoid being surrendered at all costs, and it just drug out to where the point the British were just out of supplies, out of resources, and out of time. So in 1814, the British are going to sign the Treaty of Ghent with the United States, essentially ending the war, because Britain wants to focus on what is happening in France and what is happening in Europe to try to stop Napoleon from conquering the rest of Europe and then eventually England. So even though the Treaty of War was, or the Treaty of Ghent, I'm sorry, was signed in 1814 to officially end the War of 1812, we know that technology was not the greatest. There was no tweets, there was no texting going out, emails going out to let the Americans know that the treaty was signed. So the soldiers were essentially still fighting here going on in the war, and it's going to lead up to the Battle of New Orleans, where soon to be President Andrew Jackson is going to lead the American soldiers at a crucial point in the battle, where they are going to be able to defeat the British at the Battle of New Orleans, and kind of shows this stubbornness attitude, or this rebellious attitude, or this way of standing up against the British for the American military. And moving forward, then General Andrew Jackson will emerge as a war hero. Like I mentioned earlier, he will become a future president for the Democratic Party. And this victory really kind of shows Americans enough of evidence to feel like they have won the war. So even though the Treaty of Ghent was signed prior to the Battle of New Orleans, this victory kind of gave an excuse or gave them an example to show that, yes, we have won, we've defeated the British, and we are a solid, independent America. So even though now that the Treaty of Ghent was signed in 1814 and it ended the war, some of the problems that the whole war was meant to solve were not addressed. As far as trade rights between the Americans and the British were never addressed, or even some of the other causes as far as Canada. However, the War of 1812 will have significant important effects on America. This is getting back to our central question, that Americas were united. The sense of nationalism, the sense of patriotism that America stands for something better, that they have beaten the British. And it will lead into the Monroe presidency with its era of good feelings with a popular president and a booming national economy now that trade is now free and across the Atlantic Ocean, and the sense of entitlement to move westward and to keep expanding for this American dream and this American sense of nationalism. So if we want to go back and look at that essential question that we talked about at the beginning of the lesson, how did the War of 1812 encourage American unity and nationalism? We would definitely say that because of the war and because of the outcome of the war and the Battle of New Orleans, it showed that Americans could stand up on their own, that they were a complete and independent nation, that they were separate from Britain. They did not have to take the crap that Britain and France were dishing out across the Atlantic Ocean as far as the impressing of sailors and soldiers. And even though we might not say that the War of 1812 was necessarily won, because it was just kind of mediated between the two with the Treaty of Ghent. With that Battle of New Orleans and the accomplishments there, the victories of General Andrew Jackson, it's going to give the Americans a sense of independence finally, and this idea to expand westward and to move away from the British crown and British ideals. And it's going to set us up for this antebellum period, moving into the prior to the Civil War, and this need to kind of create a true American sense. All right, so that will wrap up our lesson today on the War of 1812 and President James Madison. If you guys could please, any questions you might have had from this discussion, please bring them to class tomorrow, and I will see you then.